It was just another quiet afternoon in the small town of Maplewood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, or at least their faces. People went about their lives without much fuss, stopping by the local diner for coffee or picking up groceries after work. Life here was simple, predictable even. But sometimes beneath the calm surface things weren't always what they seemed. Jake Miller stood behind the checkout counter at Greenfield Grocers, scanning items and bagging them with practiced ease. He was 23 years old, tall but slightly awkward, with messy brown hair that always looked like it needed combing. His job wasn't exciting, just long hours spent ringing up cans of soup and boxes of cereal, but it paid the bills. And right now, paying the bills mattered more than anything else. The store wasn't busy today, which was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gave Jake time to think. On the other hand, thinking wasn't something he wanted to do too, much of lately. Not when his mind kept drifting back to Emily, his little sister. She'd gone missing 3 weeks ago, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her. The police said she probably ran away, but Jake didn't believe that. Emily wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. Something, or someone, had taken her. As Jake scanned a carton of milk, the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. He glanced up automatically, then froze. Standing there was none other than Chuck Norris. Yes, the Chuck Norris, the action star, martial artist, and all-around legend. Jake blinked, wondering if he was imagining things. But no, it really was him. Chuck walked down the aisle, grabbing a few items, a loaf of bread, some bottled water, and a pack of gum, and headed toward the register. Jake felt his heart pounding as he started ringing up the purchases. What was Chuck Norris doing in Maplewood? This wasn't exactly Hollywood. Still, Jake reminded himself to stay calm. Just act normal. Don't make a fool of yourself. But deep down he knew this might be his only chance. If anyone could help him find Emily, it was Chuck Norris. When the total came up on the screen, Jake hesitated. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for a pen and scribbled 3 words onto a scrap of paper. "Help me, please." Then, trying to look casual, he slipped the note into Chuck's hand along with his receipt. For a split second, their eyes met. Jake saw curiosity flicker across Chuck's face, followed by understanding. It was as if Chuck already knew something was wrong even before reading the note. "Have a good day," Jake said quickly, forcing a smile. His voice cracked a little, betraying his nerves, but he hoped Chuck wouldn't notice. Chuck nodded, politely, tucking the note into his pocket without saying a word. Then he turned and left the store, disappearing into the parking lot. For a moment, Jake stood there staring at the door. Had he done the right thing? Would Chuck actually do anything about it? Or would he just toss the note aside and forget all about it? Jake didn't know. All he could do now was wait. Outside, Chuck climbed into his truck, parked under the shade of a large oak tree. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the sleepy town. He leaned back in the driver's seat and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, he read the message again. "Help me, please." There were no details, no explanation, just those 3 desperate words. Chuck frowned, tapping the steering wheel thoughtfully. Over the years, he'd received plenty of fan mail and requests for autographs. Some people even asked for advice or help with personal problems. But this felt different. Whoever wrote the note hadn't been seeking fame or fortune. They were asking for salvation. And given the circumstances, Chuck couldn't ignore it. He glanced back at the grocery store where Jake was still working behind the counter. From what little interaction they'd had, Chuck could tell the young man was scared. Scared and desperate. Whatever was going on, it was serious. And if there was one thing Chuck Norris couldn't stand, it was seeing innocent people suffer. Deciding to take action, Chuck decided to stick around town for a while. He drove to a nearby cafe and ordered a cup of coffee, using the opportunity to observe the area. Maplewood seemed peaceful enough on the surface, but Chuck knew better than to trust appearances. Every town had its secrets, and this one was no exception. Later that evening, as he drove back to his cabin on the outskirts of town, Chuck noticed something unusual. A group of men was gathered outside an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Maplewood. They weren't dressed like locals. They wore dark clothes and carried themselves with a sense of purpose. One of them glanced around nervously as if making sure no one was watching. Chuck slowed down, pretending to check his phone while keeping an eye on the scene. Something about these men set off alarm bells in Chuck's mind. Their behavior suggested they weren't there casually. They were waiting for something or someone. Could this have anything to do with the note? It was possible. Either way, it was worth investigating further. Back at his cabin, Chuck sat by the fire, turning the note over in his hands. He thought about Jake, about the fear in his eyes when he handed over the paper. Fear for himself? Or for someone else? Chuck's instincts told him it was the latter. Someone close to Jake was in danger, and whatever was happening involved the men at the warehouse. Chuck picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Laura, it's me," he said. Laura Martinez was an old friend who worked in law enforcement. She'd helped Chuck on several occasions in the past, and he trusted her judgment. "Chuck? What's going on?" Laura asked, sounding surprised to hear from him. "I need your help," Chuck replied. "I'm in Maplewood, and I think there's something big happening here. Human trafficking, maybe." Laura let out a low whistle. "You're not kidding around, are you? That's heavy stuff." "Any proof?" "Not yet," Chuck admitted. "But I've got a lead. I'll fill you in later. For now, can you run a background check on any suspicious activity in the area? Look for missing persons reports, especially recent ones." "Sure thing," Laura said. "But Chuck, be careful. These guys play rough." "I always am," Chuck said with a faint smile. Hanging up, he stared into the flames, his mind racing. Tomorrow, he would return to the grocery store and talk to Jake, get more information. Until then, all he could do was prepare and hope he wasn't too late. Little did Chuck realize, however, that his decision to intervene would set off a chain of events that would change the lives of everyone involved. Because in Maplewood, nothing was ever quite as simple as it appeared, and Chuck Norris was about to discover just how complicated things could get. The next morning, Chuck returned to Greenfield Grocers. The store was busier than it had been the previous day, with shoppers filling the aisles and the hum of conversation blending with the beeping of the cash registers. Chuck grabbed a basket and wandered through the store, pretending to browse while keeping an eye on Jake. He needed to find a moment when the young man wasn't busy so they could talk privately. After about 20 minutes, Jake finally caught his gaze. For a brief second, their eyes locked, and Jake gave a subtle nod toward the back of the store. Chuck understood immediately and followed him discreetly. They slipped into a small break room tucked away behind the storage area. It was a plain, functional space with a table, a few chairs, and a coffee machine sitting on a counter. Jake closed the door behind them, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "Thanks for coming," Jake said nervously, running a hand through his messy hair. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he feared someone might hear him even here. "I didn't know who else to turn to." Chuck nodded, pulling out one of the chairs and sitting down. "Start from the beginning," he said gently. "Tell me everything." Jake hesitated, taking a deep breath before speaking. "It's my sister Emily. She's only 16. 3 weeks ago she disappeared, just vanished. No note, no warning. 1 minute she was home and the next she was gone." His fingers drummed anxiously on the tabletop. "At first I thought maybe she ran away. You know, teenagers sometimes do that. But then I started noticing things." "What kind of things?" Chuck asked, leaning forward slightly. "I saw men watching her," Jake explained. "Not just once, but multiple times. Men in dark cars parked outside our house or driving slowly past us when we were walking around town. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was coincidence. But looking back now, it makes sense. They were following her." Chuck's jaw tightened. This wasn't good. "Did you tell the police?" Jake nodded bitterly. "Yeah, I did, but they didn't take me seriously. They said Emily probably left on her own and that the cars I mentioned were just random people passing by. They told me to wait it out, that she'd come back eventually. He slammed his fist lightly on the table, frustration bubbling over. But I know something happened to her, Mr. Norris. I can feel it, and I don't know what else to do. Chuck studied the young man carefully. Jake was clearly terrified, not just for himself but for his sister. There was genuine pain in his eyes, and Chuck believed every word he said. If Emily really was missing, time was critical. Every hour that passed made it harder to find her. "Okay," Chuck said firmly. "Let's start piecing this together. Do you remember anything specific about the men you saw? Any details that stood out?" Jake thought for a moment. One of them always wore a black hoodie. Another had tattoos on his neck, snakes, I think. And their car, a black SUV. It's hard to miss because it looked brand new, shiny, like it hadn't been driven much. "That's helpful," Chuck replied, jotting down mental notes. "Anything else?" "There's this warehouse," Jake continued, "on the edge of town. It's abandoned, or at least it's supposed to be. But lately I've noticed lights on inside late at night, and sometimes I see those same black SUVs parked nearby." Chuck's instincts kicked in. That warehouse sounded suspicious, especially since he'd already spotted those men hanging around it the previous evening. It was likely connected to whatever was happening, but he needed more information before making any moves. "Do you have a picture of your sister?" Chuck asked. Jake nodded and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his photos until he found one of Emily, a smiling teenage girl with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She looked happy, carefree, completely unaware of the danger she might be in now. Chuck memorized her face, knowing he'd need to recognize her quickly if he came across her. "She loves art," Jake added softly. "She's always drawing or painting. Her favorite color is green." Chuck smiled faintly. "That'll help. People often leave traces of themselves wherever they go. Even if she's scared, she might try to leave a clue." Jake looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. "You really think you can find her?" "I'll do everything I can," Chuck promised. "But you need to trust me. Stay safe, and don't draw attention to yourself. These guys sound dangerous, and if they realize you're onto them, it could put you in harm's way." Jake swallowed hard but nodded. "I understand. Just, please, bring her back." With that, they ended their conversation. Chuck left the break room and headed back to his truck, his mind racing. He drove straight to the cabin, where he spread out a map of Maplewood on the kitchen table. Using the details Jake had provided, he marked the locations of the suspicious activity: the black SUV sightings, the warehouse, and Jake's house. A pattern began to emerge, confirming his suspicions. The trafficking ring was operating right under everyone's noses. Later that afternoon, Chuck called Laura again. "Any updates?" he asked. "Yeah, actually," Laura replied. "There have been a few missing persons reports filed recently. All young women, all within the last month. None of them have turned up yet." Chuck frowned. "That fits. Jake's sister matches the profile." Laura sighed heavily. "Listen, Chuck, I can't send backup without solid evidence, but based on what you're telling me, this sounds bad. Really bad." "I'll handle it," Chuck assured her. "Just keep digging. See if you can find any connections between the victims, friends, schools, anything." "You got it," Laura said, "and Chuck, watch your back." Chuck hung up and stared at the map again. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. Tomorrow night he would stake out the warehouse and see what he could uncover. Whatever was happening, there it was key to finding Emily and stopping whoever was behind it. As night fell, Chuck prepared for the mission ahead. He packed a few essentials, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a small notebook, and reviewed the plan in his head. He wasn't reckless. He never went into a situation unprepared. But he also knew that hesitation could cost lives. If Emily was still alive, she didn't have much time left. Before heading to bed, Chuck glanced once more at the photo of Emily on his phone. Her smile reminded him why he did what he did. People like Jake and Emily deserved a chance to live their lives free from fear, and if anyone could give them that chance, it was him. Little did Chuck realize, however, that the warehouse held far more dangers than he anticipated. What awaited him inside would test not only his skills, but also his resolve. But for now, all he could do was rest, gather his strength, and prepare for the fight ahead. Because in Maplewood, nothing was ever quite as simple as it appeared. And Chuck Norris was about to discover just how complicated things could get. The night was cold and quiet as Chuck Norris approached the abandoned warehouse on the edge of Maplewood. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by in the distance. Most people in this small town were already asleep, tucked safely in their beds. But Chuck knew better than to trust the silence. Danger often lurked where no one dared to look. He parked his truck a block away, ensuring it wouldn't draw attention. Dressed in dark clothes to blend into the shadows, he moved swiftly toward the warehouse. His steps were careful but confident, years of experience guiding him like second nature. As he drew closer, he could see faint lights glowing from within the building, proof that someone was there, despite its supposed abandonment. Chuck crouched behind a stack of crates near the entrance, studying the area carefully. Two men stood guard outside, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly. They didn't seem particularly alert, but they were armed, each carrying a handgun holstered at their side. Chuck's instincts told him these weren't ordinary criminals. They were professionals, part of something bigger. After observing them for several minutes, Chuck decided to act. Moving silently, he crept up behind the first guard who was leaning against the wall. With one quick motion, Chuck covered the man's mouth and applied pressure to a specific point on his neck. The guard went limp instantly, unconscious but alive. Chuck lowered him gently to the ground, making sure not to make a sound. Then he turned his attention to the second guard. This time, Chuck used a different tactic. He tossed a small pebble onto the roof of the warehouse, creating a soft clinking noise. The second guard turned sharply, curious about the disturbance. As soon as he stepped forward to investigate, Chuck moved in, disarming him before he could react. A swift strike to the temple rendered the second guard unconscious as well. Both men were now out of commission, tied up securely with zip ties Chuck had brought along. With the guards neutralized, Chuck slipped inside the warehouse. The interior was even darker than he'd expected, lit only by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled musty, filled with the scent of rust and decay. Cages lined the walls, some of them occupied by frightened individuals huddled together. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. Some begged silently for help while others shrank back, too terrified to speak. Chuck scanned the room quickly, searching for Emily. He spotted her almost immediately, a young girl with long, blonde hair sitting alone in a corner cage. Her head was bowed, but when she heard movement nearby, she looked up. Recognition flashed across her face when she saw Chuck. For a moment, she simply stared at him, unable to believe what she was seeing. Then, tears welled up in her eyes as hope began to replace despair. "It's okay," Chuck whispered softly, pulling a pair of bolt cutters from his bag. "I'm here to get you out." One by one, he unlocked the cages, freeing the captives. Each person thanked him quietly, their voices trembling with gratitude. Chuck instructed them to stay low and follow him closely. "We're getting out of here," he said firmly. "But we need to be careful. There are more guards around." As they made their way toward the exit, Chuck kept watch, his senses sharp. So far, everything had gone smoothly, but he knew better than to let his guard down. This kind of operation wouldn't be run by amateurs. It was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. Just as they reached the door, headlights appeared in the distance. A convoy of black SUVs sped toward the warehouse, screeching, to a halt outside. Armed men poured out of the vehicles, shouting orders and spreading out to surround the building. Chuck cursed under his breath. They'd been discovered. "Stay behind me," he instructed the group, stepping protectively in front of them. The freed captives pressed themselves against the wall, trying to remain hidden. Chuck glanced around, assessing the situation. He couldn't fight off an entire squad of armed men on his own, not without putting the others in danger, but he also couldn't leave them trapped here. Thinking quickly, Chuck led the group deeper into the warehouse, seeking cover among the piles of crates and machinery scattered throughout the space. He positioned everyone in a secluded corner, instructing them to stay quiet and still. "Don't move until I come back for you," he said firmly. Then, without waiting for a response, he disappeared into the shadows. The men entered the warehouse, their footsteps echoing loudly as they searched for intruders. One of them spotted the unconscious guards tied up near the entrance and barked orders into a radio. Within moments, the entire team was on high alert, sweeping through the building with flashlights and guns drawn. Chuck moved like a ghost, slipping between rows of crates and using the darkness to his advantage. He picked off the guards one by one, disabling them quietly and efficiently. Each encounter was over in seconds, leaving the men sprawled on the floor, groaning in pain but otherwise unharmed. Chuck wasn't interested in killing. He just needed to create enough chaos to give the captives a chance to escape. Meanwhile, the leader of the operation emerged from one of the SUVs, a tall, muscular man with a scar running down his left cheek. His name was Victor Kane, and he radiated authority. Clad in a black tactical vest and wielding a pistol, he strode into the warehouse with purpose. His sharp eyes scanned the area, taking in every detail. When he spotted Chuck darting behind a stack of crates, a cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Victor sneered, raising his gun. "Look who decided to play hero tonight." Chuck froze, turning slowly to face him. "Let them go," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "They haven't done anything wrong." Victor laughed bitterly. "And why should I listen to you? You think you can waltz in here and ruin months of hard work? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Chuck replied, evenly. "And I know what you've been doing here. It ends tonight." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, sizing each other up. Victor's confidence faltered slightly. He'd heard stories about Chuck Norris, of course, but he hadn't believed them. Now, standing face to face with the man himself, he realized those stories might not have been exaggerations after all. "You're outnumbered," Victor growled, gesturing to the remaining guards. "You don't stand a chance." "We'll see about that," Chuck said simply. Without warning, Victor lunged forward, swinging his fist toward Chuck's face. Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Victor's arm and twisting it behind his back. The gun clattered to the floor as Victor grunted in pain, but he recovered quickly, spinning around and throwing another punch. This time, Chuck blocked, it countering with a strike to Victor's ribs that sent him stumbling backward. The fight escalated rapidly, turning into a brutal exchange of blows. Victor fought viciously, fueled by anger and desperation. But Chuck was unmatched, his movements precise and calculated. Every punch, every kick landed with devastating accuracy. Despite Victor's strength, he was no match for Chuck's skill and experience. Finally, with a powerful roundhouse kick, Chuck knocked Victor off his feet. The man hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. Before he could get up, Chuck pinned him down, pressing a knee firmly against his chest. "It's over," Chuck said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder as police cars arrived on the scene. Laura Martinez had come through, alerting the authorities just in time. Officers swarmed the warehouse, arresting the remaining guards and securing the area. The freed captives emerged cautiously, blinking. In the bright lights of the patrol cars, Jake rushed forward, spotting Emily among the crowd. Tears streamed down his face as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," he choked out, holding her close. Emily hugged him back, sobbing softly. "I knew you'd find me," she whispered. "I knew you wouldn't. Give up." Chuck watched the reunion from a distance, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't need recognition or praise. All that mattered was that Emily and the others were safe. As the officers led Victor and his men away in handcuffs, Chuck slipped quietly into the shadows, disappearing once again. In the days that followed, news of the rescue spread throughout Maplewood. People marveled at the bravery of the mysterious stranger who had saved so many lives. For Jake and Emily, life slowly began to return to normal, but they would never forget the man who had risked everything to bring them home. As for Chuck Norris, he drove off into the horizon, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. Because in Maplewood, Nothing was ever quite as simple as it appeared. And Chuck Norris was always prepared to face the unexpected. The sirens wailed loudly as police cars surrounded the warehouse, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the property. Officers poured out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting commands to secure the area. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. Chuck Norris stood near the entrance, watching silently as law enforcement took over. His job here was done. The captives were safe, the criminals were captured, and justice would soon follow. Victor Kane, the ruthless leader of the trafficking ring, struggled against the grip of two officers dragging him toward a patrol car. His face was bruised and bloodied from the fight with Chuck, but his eyes burned with fury. "You think this is over?" Victor spat, glaring at Chuck as he passed by. "Men like me always find a way." Chuck didn't respond. He simply stared, back, his expression unreadable. There was no need for words. Victor's threats carried no weight now. Whatever power he once held had been stripped away, leaving him nothing more than a defeated criminal awaiting trial. As the officers loaded Victor and his men into the police cars, Laura Martinez approached Chuck. She wore her standard issue uniform, her badge gleaming under the harsh glow of the headlights. Her dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and her sharp brown eyes reflected both gratitude and admiration. "You did it," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I wasn't sure you could pull this off, but you actually did it." Chuck shrugged modestly. "It wasn't just me. You got the cops here in time. That made all the difference." Laura crossed her arms, studying him carefully. Still, not everyone could have walked into that kind of danger and come out on top. These guys weren't amateurs. They were organized, dangerous. And yet, here we are. Chuck nodded, glancing toward the freed captives. They were gathered near one of the ambulances, wrapped in blankets and sipping cups of water provided by paramedics. Some were still crying, overwhelmed by the realization that they were finally free. Others sat quietly, staring blankly ahead, trying to process everything that had happened. Among them, Jake and Emily clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. "I couldn't have left them there," Chuck said softly. "Not when I knew I could help." Laura followed his gaze, her expression softening. "They're lucky you came along, all of them." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and rusted metal. Despite the grim surroundings, there was a sense of closure, a feeling that something terrible had been stopped before it could claim more lives. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Laura asked after a pause. "Go ahead," Chuck replied. "What made you take the note seriously? Most people would have brushed it off or assumed it was a prank." Chuck thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just the note. It was the look in Jake's eyes when he handed it to me. Fear, desperation, like his whole world was falling apart. When someone looks at you like that, you don't ignore it. You listen." Laura smiled faintly. "That's what makes you different, Chuck. A lot of people wouldn't have bothered." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention back to the scene unfolding around them. Paramedics continued tending to the former captives, while investigators combed through the warehouse, collecting evidence and documenting the horrors hidden inside. Boxes of supplies, makeshift living quarters, and even records detailing the operation's activities were uncovered. It was clear this trafficking ring had been operating for months, preying on vulnerable individuals and destroying countless lives. Jake eventually broke away from Emily and approached Chuck, his steps hesitant but determined. "Mr. Norris," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay you." Chuck placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "You don't owe me anything. Just take care of your sister and yourself. That's repayment enough." Tears welled up in Jake's eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "I will. I promise." Emily stepped forward, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her blonde hair fell messily around her face, and her blue eyes still glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought I'd never see my brother again." Chuck knelt down slightly so he was eye level with her. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. Don't ever forget that." She nodded, managing a small smile despite everything she'd been through. "I won't." As Jake and Emily returned to the ambulance, Laura joined Chuck once more. "What happens now?" she asked. "Are you sticking around for a bit? We'll probably need your statement for the investigation." Chuck shook his head. "I should get going. People tend to notice when I stick around too long." He smiled faintly, his tone light but firm. "Besides, there's always somewhere else I'm needed." Laura chuckled. "Always the mystery man, huh?" "It's better that way," Chuck replied. "Fewer questions, fewer complications." She nodded understandingly. "Well, safe travels, Chuck, and thanks again for everything." With that, Chuck turned and walked back to his truck, parked a block away. As he drove off into the night, the flashing lights of the police cars grew smaller and smaller in his rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely. Maplewood faded behind him, its quiet streets returning to normalcy now that the immediate threat was gone. But Chuck knew better than to think the world was free of danger. Evil existed everywhere, in big cities, small towns, and even remote corners of the globe. It wore many faces and took many forms, and though he couldn't stop it all, he could make a difference wherever he went, one town at a time, one life at a time. Hours later, as dawn began to break over the horizon, Chuck pulled into a secluded rest stop to refuel and grab a cup of coffee. He leaned against his truck, sipping the steaming liquid while watching the sun rise. The sky shifted from deep indigo to soft pink, bathing the landscape in golden light. It was moments like these that reminded him why he kept moving forward, why he kept fighting. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text message from Laura. "They found evidence linking Victor's crew to cases across 3 states. You saved a lot of people tonight." Chuck smiled faintly, tucking the phone back into his pocket without responding. Recognition wasn't important to him. What mattered was knowing he'd made a difference, even if only for a handful of lives. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Chuck climbed back into his truck and started the engine. Another day, another road ahead. Wherever trouble brewed, he'd be ready. Because in a world full of uncertainty, one thing remained constant. Chuck Norris would always stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And so, the legend lived on. Not because of fame or glory, but because of the quiet, steadfast courage that defined him. Days turned into weeks, and life in Maplewood slowly began to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a traumatic event. For Jake and Emily Miller, every day felt like a gift. They had survived something unimaginable, and though the scars would take time to heal, they were determined to move forward together. Jake sat on the couch in their small but cozy living room, flipping through an old photo album. Emily was curled up beside him, her legs tucked under a soft blanket. The television was off, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of pages and the distant chirping of birds outside the window. It was a quiet afternoon, one they both cherished deeply. "This was from your 8th birthday," Jake said, pointing to a picture of Emily blowing out candles on a brightly decorated cake. Her face was smudged with frosting, and she wore a party hat tilted slightly to one side. Emily laughed softly, tracing the edge of the photograph with her finger. "I remember that day. Mom made me wear that silly hat all evening. She said it looked cute," Jake teased, nudging her gently. "And I think she was right." They shared a smile, the kind that comes not just from reminiscing about happy memories, but also from realizing how far they'd come since those carefree days. Life hadn't been easy for either of them lately, but moments like this reminded them of what truly mattered: family. Despite everything, Emily was resilient. She attended counseling sessions twice a week, talking to a therapist who helped her process the trauma she'd endured. At first, she found it difficult to open up, but over time she learned to express her feelings without fear or shame. Jake joined her for some of the sessions, wanting to better understand how he could support her. Together, they worked through the pain step by step. Meanwhile, news of the rescue continued to spread throughout Maplewood. People marveled at the bravery of the mysterious stranger who had saved so many lives. Some even called him a modern-day hero, though no one knew much about him beyond his name, Chuck Norris. To most residents, he remained an enigma, a figure whose actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Jake often thought about Chuck, wondering where he might be now. He wanted to thank him again, not just for saving Emily, but for restoring his faith in humanity during one of the darkest periods of his life. Without Chuck's intervention, Jake wasn't sure what might have happened to his sister or to himself. The thought sent chills down his spine. One evening, Jake decided to write a letter. Sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, he poured his heart onto the page. "Dear Mr. Norris, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say it anyway. Thank you doesn't feel like enough, but it's all I have. You saved my sister, and in doing so, you saved me too. Before you came along, I felt helpless, like there was nothing I could do to fix things. But seeing how hard you fought for us, well, it reminded me that good people still exist in this world. I hope wherever you are, you're safe. And I hope you know how much you mean to everyone whose lives you touched here in Maplewood. We won't forget you. Sincerely, Jake and Emily." When he finished writing, Jake folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. He didn't know where to send it, but that didn't matter. Writing it had been cathartic, a way to put his gratitude into words. At school, Emily faced challenges of her own. Returning to class after weeks away wasn't easy. Some students whispered behind her back, speculating about what had happened. Others avoided her altogether, unsure of what to say. But a few friends reached out, offering kindness and support when she needed it most. Her art teacher, Mrs. Carter, played a particularly important role in Emily's recovery. Recognizing her talent and creativity, Mrs. Carter encouraged Emily to channel her emotions into her artwork. "Painting can be therapeutic," she told her one afternoon. "It's okay to let yourself feel everything. You don't have to hide it." Inspired by these words, Emily began working on a new project, a mural depicting hope and resilience. She spent hours sketching and painting, losing herself in the vibrant colors and bold strokes. When it was finally complete, she invited Jake to see it. "It's amazing," he said, standing back to admire the finished piece. The mural showed a lone tree growing from cracked soil, its branches reaching toward a bright blue sky. Birds soared overhead, and flowers bloomed at its base despite the harsh surroundings. "What does it mean?" Jake asked, curious. "It means we can grow stronger even when things seem impossible," Emily explained. "No matter how broken the ground feels, there's always a way to rise above it." Jake hugged her tightly, proud of the strength she'd shown. "You're incredible, you know that?" She blushed, but smiled. "Thanks, Jake." As the weeks passed, the town rallied around the victims of the trafficking ring, organizing fundraisers and community events to raise awareness and support. Flyers were posted in shop windows, urging people to stay vigilant and report anything suspicious. Though the nightmare was over, its impact lingered, serving as a reminder of the importance of looking out for one another. Laura Martinez became a regular presence in Maplewood, working closely with local authorities to ensure the town remained safe. She visited Jake and Emily occasionally, checking in to see how they were coping. "You two are inspiring," she told them during one visit. "Not everyone could bounce back the way you have." "We're trying," Jake admitted. "Some days are harder than others, but we're getting there." Laura nodded knowingly. "That's all anyone can ask for." Though Chuck Norris was long gone, his influence lingered in unexpected ways. Jake started volunteering at a local shelter, helping families in need while keeping an eye out for anyone who might be struggling silently. Emily joined him whenever she could, using her art to brighten the space and bring joy to those who visited. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors began referring to them as the Millers who make a difference, a title they accepted humbly. "We're just paying it forward," Jake would say whenever someone complimented them. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake and Emily would sit on the porch, watching the stars, appear one by one. They talked about the future, about dreams they hoped to achieve and places they wanted to visit. For the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to dream big. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Emily asked one night, referring to Chuck. Jake shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe not. But does it really matter? What he did for us, that's something we'll carry with us forever." Emily nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yeah, forever." And so, life went on. The wounds of the past would never fully disappear, but they became part of the story, a testament to the strength and courage it took to overcome adversity. Jake and Emily knew they weren't alone. They had each other, their community, and the memory of a man who had changed their lives forever. Because in Maplewood, nothing was ever quite as simple as it appeared, and sometimes heroes walked among them, leaving footprints of hope in their wake. The open road stretched endlessly before Chuck Norris, winding through fields of tall grass and beneath skies painted with the colors of twilight. He had left Maplewood behind days ago, driving farther west with no particular destination in mind. For Chuck, it wasn't about where he was going. It was about being ready to help wherever he was needed next. His truck carried everything he required: a few changes of clothes, some tools, and a map marked with places he might explore someday. It was a simple life, but it suited him. As the miles rolled by, Chuck often found himself reflecting on what had happened in Maplewood. Saving Jake's sister Emily, and the others trapped in that warehouse, had been just another chapter in a long story of doing what was right. To most people, his actions would seem extraordinary, almost larger than life. But to Chuck, they were simply part of who he was. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone willing to step up when others couldn't or wouldn't. Still, there were moments when he wondered if he'd made a difference, not just in Maplewood, but in all the towns and cities he'd passed through over the years. Were the people he'd helped still okay? Had their lives truly improved because of his intervention? These questions lingered in his mind, though he never dwelled on them for too long. What mattered most was the present, the here and now, and whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as he pulled into a small diner off the highway, Chuck noticed a familiar face sitting at the counter. It took him a moment to place it, but then it clicked. Laura Martinez, the officer who had assisted him during the rescue operation. She looked up from her coffee cup, surprised to see him walk in. "Chuck?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "What are you doing here?" He smiled faintly, sliding onto the stool beside her. "Just passing through, grabbing a bite to eat." Laura chuckled. "Of course you are, always on the move." They chatted for a while, catching up on recent developments. Laura told him how the investigation into Victor Kane's trafficking ring had expanded, uncovering connections to operations in neighboring states. Several arrests had been made, and dozens of missing persons cases had finally been resolved, thanks to the evidence collected at the warehouse. "That's good news," Chuck said, sipping his coffee. "Means fewer people out there suffering." Laura nodded, her expression turning serious. "We owe a lot of that to you, you know. If you hadn't stepped in, but I did," Chuck interrupted gently. "And so did you. We worked together, remember?" She smiled, shaking her head. "You're impossible, you know that? Always deflecting credit. But seriously, thank you. Not just for Maplewood, but for reminding me why I got into this job in the first place. Sometimes it's easy to forget why we do what we do." Chuck didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. "It's not about us," he said after a moment. "It's about the people who need help, that's all that matters." Laura watched him for a moment, sensing the weight of his words. "Well, wherever you're headed next, be safe. And don't disappear completely, okay? People like having heroes around, even if you don't think of yourself that way." Chuck smirked slightly. "Heroes are overrated. Just call me a guy trying to make a difference." After finishing their meal, they parted ways, exchanging a quick handshake before Chuck climbed back into his truck. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for moments like these, brief encounters that reminded him he wasn't alone in his mission. There were good people out there, working hard to protect others and make the world a better place. All he had to do was keep moving forward, trusting that paths would cross when they were meant to. Days turned into weeks, and Chuck continued his journey, stopping occasionally in small towns to refuel or stretch his legs. Along the way, he heard stories, some inspiring, others heartbreaking. In one town, he met an elderly man who ran a free community garden, providing fresh produce to families struggling to make ends meet. In another, he listened as a young woman described her efforts to start a shelter for runaway teens. Each person he encountered added another layer to his understanding of humanity's resilience, but not every stop was filled with hope. In a dusty roadside bar, Chuck overheard a group of men talking about a nearby factory rumored to exploit undocumented workers. Their conversation was casual, almost dismissive, as if the suffering of others didn't matter. Chuck's instincts kicked in immediately. After gathering more information, he decided to investigate further. That night, under the cover of darkness, Chuck approached the factory. Its windows were dark, but faint noises echoed from within, machines humming, voices murmuring. Using his skills, he slipped inside unnoticed, careful to avoid security cameras and patrolling guards. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. Rows of exhausted workers laboring in unsafe conditions, their faces hollow with fatigue. Chuck knew he couldn't handle this alone. He contacted local authorities anonymously, providing them with detailed information about the factory's operations. Within hours, police raided the facility, freeing the workers and arresting those responsible. Once again, justice prevailed. But this time, Chuck remained in the shadows, letting others take the spotlight. As autumn gave way to winter, Chuck found himself drawn to colder climates. Snow-covered mountains replaced rolling hills, and icy winds whipped across barren landscapes. Despite the harsh weather, he felt at peace. There was something cleansing about the cold, a reminder that even the harshest seasons eventually gave way to spring. One snowy afternoon, Chuck stopped at a gas station nestled in the heart of a tiny mountain town. While filling up his tank, he noticed a bulletin board covered in flyers. One caught his eye, a plea for help finding a lost hiker. According to the flyer, a young man named Alex had gone missing 3 days earlier while exploring the nearby trails. Search teams had been combing the area but hadn't found any trace of him. Without hesitation, Chuck grabbed the flyer and set off toward the trailhead. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he climbed higher into the mountains, scanning the terrain for signs of movement. Hours passed and the temperature dropped steadily, but Chuck pressed on. Finally, near dusk, he spotted a figure huddled beneath a rocky overhang, shivering uncontrollably. "Hey," Chuck called out softly, approaching cautiously. The young man looked up, his eyes wide with shock and relief. I thought no one would find me," Alex stammered, his voice weak but grateful. "You're not alone anymore," Chuck assured him, wrapping a thermal blanket around his shoulders. "Let's get you home." By the time they reached the base of the mountain, word of the rescue had spread through the town. Residents gathered outside the ranger station, cheering as Alex was reunited with his family. Once again, Chuck slipped away quietly, avoiding the attention and accolades. As he drove back onto the open road, Chuck reflected on the countless lives he'd touched over the years. Some remembered his name, others forgot it entirely. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the impact. Small acts of kindness and bravery that rippled outward, touching hearts and changing destinies. In Maplewood, Jake and Emily hung the letter Jake had written to Chuck on their living room wall, alongside Emily's mural. Though they doubted he'd ever read it, the act of writing it had brought them closer together, reinforcing their belief in the goodness of humanity. And so Chuck Norris continued his journey, a quiet guardian traveling through a world full of challenges and triumphs. Wherever he went, he carried with him the lessons he'd learned and the memories of those he'd helped. Because in the end, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making a difference, one life at a time. Because in Maplewood and everywhere else, nothing was ever quite as simple as it appeared. And Chuck Norris was always prepared to face the unexpected.